Hello, I'm Bob the Bookerer and welcome to my channel. Just tighten up that shirt there we go. A couple of days ago, a video went out about the Wainwright Prize for nature writing, and today I'm going to be talking about the Global Conservation Prize as well. And so these two prizes are also joined by a third, which is for children's and young adult writing. But I'm going to focus on these two just because I don't think I really have the expertise really around children's lit to know what's good, what's sort of hitting the right notes, but there we go. And instead I'm going to talk about these. And I just, again, like with the nature writing ones, so many of my favourite books last year came from these two shortlists, and I pretty much know that a lot of my favourite non-fiction books of the year are also going to be from this from this prize, just because I think it's such high quality writing. They're so clever as books, so intelligent and so powerful in terms of how they talk about the world around us. So without any further ado, let's get started on this wonderful shortlist. First up, going alphabetically by the author's surnames, we have Alice Bell with Our Biggest Experiment. And this book is basically a history of the climate crisis and of climate change more generally. And it's one of those books that, again, on the surface, this sounds like it should be quite dry. And there are some chapter headings or deviations that she goes on where you would, from a distance, you would think that this is going to be incredibly dry, just because of the topic areas. Actually, this book is anything but. I found it really funny, really clever, really wise, really perceptive. And was probably one of my favourites from the list. I just think it's incredibly clever because it does this really interesting and exciting thing of finding the small individual stories that are incredibly interesting and exciting, but that build to a much bigger picture. So we're not just learning the things that we might already know about, but instead we're kind of getting an insight into so Shell, the company, the sort of oil company, that it's partly named because there was it's the original business that created lots of money was people getting seashells from the coast, washing them and then reselling them. And so there was just this sort of house full of women cleaning shells and selling them, and that sort of eventually then later became the business of Shell, but that was sort of where the initial money came from almost. And we get all these really small interesting stories that are just so baffling and so interesting, and it's all told with a real sense of humour. There's a real warmth to this book. The audiobook especially, I think, is really fun for this, of just telling a story and you can kind of tell when there's a joke that's sort of been left in and sort of not quite been cut out, and it's really fun for that. I think this is such a clever book. It really maps out a great amount of the history of what's happened to lead up to this current moment, and as a result sort of gives a bit of an insight into what actually might be able to be done about it as well. So one of my favourites from the list, and I think it's just a really great book. Next up, we have Silent Earth by Dave Goulson, and this is a book about insects, and there are two insect books on this list, and I'll kind of cover them pretty much together in this as well, because I think they mention a lot of the same people, they mention a lot of the same articles and a lot of the same topics, but I think both do their own thing really, really well as well. So Silent Earth talks a lot about, it takes its sort of name from Silent Spring by Rachel Carson, and it looks forward to what are the things that are actually affecting these ecosystems of insects and what that then means for the wider world. So actually, if we're spraying certain pesticides, that will destroy certain insects, but actually we then see that years down the line, that has a massive impact on bird numbers, because birds eat those insects and are either poisoned by them, or there aren't enough of those insects to go around anymore because they've all been killed by pesticides. And so it has these weird knock-on effects. We see things like bees being massively affected, and obviously that then has a massive effect on fertilization of plants and of crops and many, many other things. And whereas this all sounds like it should be incredibly depressing, because we're talking about essentially climate collapse, colony collapse, all of these many other things, and what that might look like in a future of increased population where we may just have a vast number of people going hungry. This book, I think, is incredibly wise and generous in terms of how it looks forward to the future. It feels quite positive, but also recognises that there are very big things that need to be changed. And I think a large part of this book is also really getting us to rethink our relationship with insects. The fact that we often treat them as pests, and yeah, you don't necessarily want a spider crawling over your face, but actually you know, these insects are all doing various jobs, and they're all holding parts of the universe together in many ways. And so what I think is just so brilliant about this book is just how much of his joy is infectious in this book. You really, I found myself actually, I was listening to this book, and a fly was sort of, at one point, a fly kind of crept on me, and I went to kind of go and like smash with my hand, and was like, oh, actually, maybe not. I can't let Dave Goulson down. And so I didn't. I just sort of shooed it away and carried on with my life. And I think that's part of what this book is about. It's about sort of reframing our relationship with insects. And on a similar note, we also have Oliver Milman with the insect crisis, and many of the same things come up in this book. We talk a lot about neonicotinoids, which are the sort of pesticides that have really been affecting bees, and sort of having a really big effect on many other insects that are part of the ecosystem. But also I think this book talks a lot about the kind of the what if aspect of, if we were to lose certain insects, what actually does the world look like? And in Dave Goulson's book as well, there is also this sort of really interesting conversation of like, yeah, we might think like, oh God, we lose slow worms, who cares? But actually some of those insects we might not see the impact of immediately. We might not see them at all, but it's still important. And likewise in the insect crisis, we learn a lot about those what if moments of, if we were to suddenly lose insects overnight, what does that look like? What things can we start doing societally to make sure that we can look after them? Whether that's creating little banks of, overgrowth and sort of, weeds and whatever that might help them have a little habitat that can kind of create things later down the line, or, what other things can we be doing to really look after them? So I think these two books in tandem do a really great job in really reframing that whole discussion. Next up, we have another one of my favourites, George Monbiot with Regenesis. And this book is controversial in many ways. And I know that there are some criticisms about potentially cherry picking bits of research, or about this maybe being a fairly radical look forward. I always just really enjoy George Monbiot's writing. I think he has a real fire to the way he writes, a real sort of passion and sort of point of view. And in this book, he advocates for the idea of essentially stopping farming almost altogether, so that actually the amount of land that we give over to farming is land that where we're sort of is inefficient in some ways. We're growing soy to give to animals who also need their own land, all to create protein or food or sustenance for humans, whereas actually if we cut out the middleman and get rid of the cows, or are not intensively farming cows, we could just eat the soy ourselves. And so that's part of a big focus of this book. But also he looks at brand new other things that have been created, so creating new proteins out of various products or things that are lab grown, like lab grown meats or lab grown proteins, that also can do the job as well, particularly for a growing population. And many other things. And he then talks about giving back some of that land to fighting the climate crisis by having that as carbon sinks, or having that as sort of areas for natural habitats to regrow. And so he talks quite a lot about this, and again, controversial in many ways, but I really enjoy the daringness of this book, the ambition to go and focus on some of these areas, and to really think about a different future in that way. And so I really greatly enjoyed this book, and think he's also just a great advocate for many things around nature and for fighting the climate crisis. So I really enjoy his works. Next up, we have Ben Rawlence with The Treeline. And this is a book that talks a lot about, as you would expect, trees, but also just really vegetation generally and how it fights the climate crisis. So he talks about how many cultures have long histories related to the natural world, and particularly to trees, and how they see that as part of their culture. So not only sort of native, First Nation peoples in the Americas, but also we've got, for example, people in the far north of Russia and sort of that kind of area where there's also a real reliance on bits of nature, but also underwater and in all these other places. And he talks about how those tree lines have been receding as we've been cutting things down, and as we've been removing them often in the world. But what I think is so interesting about this book is that it also just kind of almost just talks a lot about the joy of these plants, that trees themselves are just quite miraculous in terms of not only how they communicate with each other, but how they are kind of a central point for so much of other bits of nature. You know, they work alongside various microbes and whatever to kind of regulate the soil and regulate the land. They are a really big fixture in protecting other species, you know, by providing shelter or resources or whatever else. And so there's a sort of real reverence for trees in this book that I think I found really captivating as well. Then we come to the winner from this year, which was Dan Saladino's Eating to Extinction. And I think this is just such an interesting idea for a book. It essentially tours the world looking at various food crops that have either gone extinct or are close to going extinct. And so in one example, he talks about in a war-torn area, there was a very specific type of melon, and everybody just assumed that it had all gone when all the plantations of it had been bombed, and actually some seeds still existed and this thing could continue. But actually there's such a strong sense of belonging that comes with some of these foods. You know, people have memories of their grandmothers making this specific food, or this time their father fed them this thing, or the time they went and, you know, pulled up some of the crops for some of this thing. You know, all of these memories that are tied in specific places. And he basically makes an argument in this book about not only returning to a really slow food kind of way of being, where we kind of really appreciate seasonal food, where we really appreciate the things around us, but also how quickly these things can disappear. You know, you've got seed banks, like there's one in Norway, to protect some of the world's crops in case of things going extinct. But actually what's also happened in recent years is that certain ones have crowded out others in the market. So I think it's something like 90%. It was a really ridiculously high percentage of all bananas that we eat all come from basically the same few species. And actually there are all these other ones that are out there. Having all of them be from the same species means that they're all vulnerable often to the same diseases. And whereas, you know, in the past, having a broad variety of tons of different types of apple or banana or whatever would mean that only some would die and the other ones would survive. What we now see is that, you know, one thing happening in Florida can affect most of the world's crops of oranges, for example, and that we're then at real risk potentially of certain foods going extinct, or people kind of facing starvation because a whole crop has just been wiped out overnight, particularly when we come to key crops like wheat or potatoes or various fruits or whatever as well. Really, really interesting book, and so cleverly researched and so passionately written, I think, as well. And last but definitely not least, probably my favourite from this list, or at least one of them, definitely, Wildfell by Lee Schofield. And this is a book that I just found really quite profound. It's talking about rewilding various parts of nature, and in many ways just getting out of nature's way, letting local plants kind of grow, you know, where they're meant to be growing, not kind of intervening and putting new plants there, letting creatures interact with their environment in the way that they're meant to be, and also not really destroying in many ways at all. So he talks a lot about his work and how that intersects with this, and how often he comes up against either farmers or sort of local people who are angry about what they see as him intervening and telling them what not to do. And actually his argument is often, we want to be doing as little harm as possible, right? Soil has its own way of doing these things. Nature is kind of, you know, is the leader here. We should be following their example. We get out of their way. We take from it. We support it in whatever way we can, but we don't interfere. And at one point, there's this really beautiful passage where he visits a part of Norway, and particularly a very untouched area that for many years has just been left without really any human intervention. And what that's meant is that these rare flowers are really thriving, or these lots of the crops and sort of plants and things there are very similar to various parts of the UK. But whereas in the UK, those flowers have almost disappeared, in that area they're really thriving because they've been left to do their own thing. Many things around them have also supported that. And I think it's just such a passionately and beautifully written book. And I just think is a real stunning piece of literature as well. So I really highly recommend it. As I do the whole shortlist, as you may have guessed. I thoroughly enjoyed reading this entire shortlist. These books just really appeal to me in a big way. If you love nature writing, I think these books will do it for you in some way. And there's a big enough range here that, you know, whether you're more interested in sort of nature or trees or insects or the history of it or food or sort of theoretical future thinking, there's something for everyone here. So I really highly recommend you check them out. I think this is just such a fabulous prize, and I'm so glad that it's showcased these books and brought them to my attention as well, so I can sit and enjoy and read them. I have been Bob the Bookerer, talking about these books. Take care and speak to you all soon. Bye bye.